Barbara Califf. I'm co-president of the League of Women Voters of Los Alamos. I'd like to welcome you tonight. So the State League of Women Voters is conducting a study of nuclear waste storage and hopefully permanent deposit site. And tonight we're going to have a talk by Kathy Taylor, who's a member of our league, and she's on the state study committee. And she was a nuclear safety analyst at the lab. Kathy has a PhD in nuclear chemistry, and she worked at a nuclear electric utility for 11 years. For 7 years, she was at Rocky Flats, and she retired from Los Alamos National Laboratory as a nuclear safety analyst. She says she's an aspiring gardener, and she's also the treasurer of our local league. And John Heaton has come to see us from Carlsbad. He's chairman of the Eddie Lee Energy Alliance Board, and he has a Bachelor of Science degree from UNM, and he's a pharmacist. He served as New Mexico State Representative for District 55 from 1997 to 2010. So Kathy's going to begin speaking, and then John will speak. You want them to ask questions as you go, or at the end?
Let's hold the questions.
So please hold questions till they're finished speaking. Thank you.
Okay, so what is this? This is the wrong version. Okay, good. Okay, so we're going to be talking about spent fuel storage, nuclear fuel, and I am not the world's leading expert on this, but I am a member of the local league who can spell nuclear, and so I have agreed to talk about this. So if you have any really hard questions, look them up. Okay, so this is what. Okay, here we go. So, nuclear fuel, what is it? These are little fuel pellets. They're about the size of the little pinky on your finger, on your small finger. That's about how big they are. And they stack them all up in these fuel rods to make something that's maybe 12 feet long. And then they arrange those things in bundles of, for some reactors, they're like 8 rods wide. For some reactors, they're 14 by 14 arrays. And so that makes a fuel assembly. And you put a few hundred of those inside a nuclear reactor, and they start to fission and make heat, and use that heat to boil water, and voila, you get electricity out the end, okay? But we're not really going to talk about that tonight. We're talking about storage. This is a storage cask. They're steel and concrete, and quite a few of these bundles can go inside of one of these storage casks. So, why are we talking about this now? Did this come out of the blue? It's because there's been some developments lately. There are 2 facilities, very close to us actually, that have applied for licenses to store some of these assemblies in what they call a consolidated independent spent fuel storage facility. And the other thing is the federal administration has decided that they would like to restart the Yucca Mountain project. And so they are trying to get some money into the budget this year to fund that work. So, new things going on. Just to give you a little perspective, whoops, here we go. The generator sites, there's 99 operating U.S. reactors. These are commercial nuclear reactors. There are other reactors. The Navy operates reactors. DOE operates reactors. There are research reactors. There are a lot of reactors around the country, but these are the commercial operating reactors. 7 reactors have been shut down. There are 14 in safe store. They're shut down with delayed decommissioning. 19 reactors are scheduled for decommissioning. So this spent fuel in these bundles that I told you about are arranged in the reactor in very huge arrays, 500 or something like bundles or something like that. They're in water. When they come out of when they get 4 or 5 years old, they're not as efficient as they should be, and so they take them out of the reactor and they put them in the spent fuel pool, and there they spend 5 to 10 years cooling down. And the plan was that once they cooled down, then they would go off and be reprocessed. But if you remember back in something like 1977 or whatever, the United States decided we didn't want to reprocess anymore. We weren't going to do that and made it illegal to reprocess fuel. So these assemblies got stuck in those reactors, fuel pools. So a lot of these fuel pools started to fill up because the reactors keep operating, the fuel keeps coming out, it keeps getting put in the fuel pool, keeps cooling down, and they just keep getting fuller and fuller and fuller, and pretty soon they run out of storage. Then they tried something they called re-racking. They would put like cadmium rods, plates inside of the fuel pool and with new racks, and put more fuel in there than was originally intended. And that lasted for a while. But then they said, you know, we need some place to put all this stuff, and there wasn't any place to put it. So the NRC licensed something that they called a, this thing has shut down, oh there we go, okay. An independent spent fuel storage installation. So now there's 78 of these things in 34 states, and the NRC says these things are really good for 120 years. There's also 6 orphan sites. These are reactors that have been shut down, and there's no reactor operating there, so most of the personnel are gone. The only thing left there are security personnel and radiation protection personnel. And the utilities, you might imagine, are very unhappy with that because they would like to reuse this property that they have sitting there being held up just with spent fuel. So, geez, this is really the old presentation. I thought I'd put my new one on there, but this one is really blurry. I had a clear one. Anyway, these are the spent fuel storage installations that are scattered around the country, and you can see there's quite a few of them. They're kind of concentrated in the eastern part of the country. In general, there's one at every reactor site because every reactor pretty much has run out of space in their fuel pool by now. And there are a few others, and here are the ones that we're going to be talking about specifically tonight. There's one up here in, is that Utah? That was licensed actually in 2002, I think. And they were heavily opposed by the state of Utah. And I think they asked the NRC to suspend their license. So, I really apologize for these blurry slides because I did put clear slides in here, but they're got the wrong version of my program. Okay, so, and this is where the operating reactors are, and you'll notice that most of these reactors are in the eastern part of the country, and out here is Nevada, with no reactors, and they're very unhappy about being stuck with Yucca Mountain. This is, oops, I keep hitting the wrong button here. This is the one that was shut down. It's not really currently licensed, I don't think. The NRC predicts that interim storage will be necessary for 160 years. That's because the country is very reluctant. We've already been working on Yucca Mountain for 35 years. We are not there yet. We're not at the end of that road. There's more licensing steps to go. There's lots more opposition, more lawsuits to be filed, more lawyers to be hired. And so, and even if Yucca Mountain were operating, it was only licensed for 70,000 metric tons, whereas there's more fuel than that out there right now. It was always intended this would be a start, not the final solution. This would be the first one, and there would be 6 more that was initially talked about in the 1982 Complete Waste Policy Act. And so this 160 years, when you think about, it took us that long to get there, we haven't got there yet. Even once you open Yucca Mountain, assuming you did that, you had to ship all that fuel there, you had to package it or whatever you have to do, put it underground, all of these things. It's a very incremental process, and so they're saying, well, 70 years, 160 years. So there's 2 applications in the process. The first one, Waste Control Specialists, filed their application with the NRC in April of 2016. And the other one is Eddy Lee County facility, which John Heaton's going to talk about. He knows lots about that, which I don't. So this facility, it's already, this is a very big property. It's 1,400 acres. It is as close to New Mexico as you can get to New Mexico without being in it. It's a half mile from the border, and it's 6 miles from Eunice, New Mexico. So it's already licensed to bury low-level waste, and they've been doing that for I don't know how long, but they did accept, you know, when Lanel had its little oopsie with the true waste, they took some of that true waste at this site in Andrews, Texas. It's not in Andrews. It's actually 35 miles from Andrews. You might call it Eunice site. But in any case, some of that waste, I think, is still there. It hasn't really gotten back to WIP yet. So they are planning to receive spent nuclear fuel in 2021. So they recognize it's going to take a while to get through the licensing process. It'll take a while to get contracts in place with the utilities to send their waste and all that stuff. They initially wanted to bring this waste from these orphan sites, which is a pressing issue with the utilities. And so this year, they asked NRC to suspend their application because basically they didn't have the money. They were planning to get the money by merging with this company, Energy Solutions, which is another big low-level waste burial company, and et cetera. But the court said, you guys are too much like each other. You would degrade competition, therefore you cannot merge. So this is suspended, but the NRC believes that they will find another partner, and this application will be reinstated. So that will be coming. Reactor decommissioning. This shows the sites that are either ready for decommissioning, being decommissioned, on hold for decommissioning. Safe store means that the reactor is shut down, and they have taken out the fuel, they've taken out all the fluids, they've basically cleaned up the easy stuff, but now that reactor is sitting there waiting, and this is usually because there's a second reactor on the same site. And so they calculated it's going to be cheaper to decommission 2 at once than sequentially. So they're waiting at many of these sites for the second reactor to shut down, which might be, another 20 years, or who knows how long that might be. But they are in what the NRC calls safe storage mode. So they're basically stable, and they're a protected site. They're subject to radiation technician monitoring and stuff like that, security monitoring. Well, I don't know. Security is just to keep people from going in there and getting killed, right? So this is what the Waste Control Specialist site looks like. It's an above-ground site. There's this big concrete pad, and I don't think any of this is built. This is all kind of, a conceptual design. to hold 40,000 metric tons of fuel. They're going to operate at one, and the first phase would be 5,000 metric tons. That's what's coming from those orphan reactors. There's already a rail line coming by here, and so they want to build a siding at each end of this site to unload the casks. Most fuel is transferred using trucks or rail. Rail is really favored. And I think this is the level waste site, but I didn't have all these numbers and stuff, so I'm not exactly sure what all these buildings are. But in any case, you see they're adjacent, and that's what they have in mind. So that's what it would look like. That's their, and that's actually what a current independent spent fuel storage facility installation looks like right now at a reactor site. It's just these casks. They call these dry cask storage. They're huge. I don't know, hundreds of tons. I don't know. They weigh a lot. What they do with the fuel is they put it inside of a metal cask, metal container of some kind. They weld it shut, and they put it inside of another container, and they weld it shut. And these things are, there's a NRC regulation that says how you have to test these things, how you have to store them and inspect them and all those things to ensure that these things will be stable over time. And you have to analyze accidents, airplane crashes into this array. You have a rail line going by, you have to assume there's going to be a derailment connect, fuel fires from the fuel on an airplane or whatever. You have to analyze everything that you find is a credible accident. So here we are at Ely County, and I'm going to let John take over at this point, okay?
First of all, I'm John Heaton, and I am the chairman of the board of the Eddy Lee Energy Alliance, and we're made up of Carlsbad and Hobbs and Eddy and Lee counties. And we have 2 members that represent each one of the public entities, one of whom must be an elected official. We found ourselves at one point with most of the people on our board were not elected, and we felt like there was a lack of communication back to the public entities. So we changed the rules so at least one person from each entity has to be an elected official. So we believe that may help the communications. You know how that works. It sometimes doesn't. So at any rate, this is a little bit about what you've already seen. It just shows you where the fuel is around the country and how much is there. I won't go into that. So let me go through a little bit of a discussion of why we need interim storage and a consolidated interim storage. It's really the missing piece to what I would characterize as a system to deal with the back end of the fuel cycle. We really haven't had a system. It's been very disparate. Nobody really knows how the whole thing works, but I think it could be part of what I would call a real system to get to disposal. So you would have the generation, you would have interim storage, then you would get to disposal. So interim storage is a very safe process. It's being used at virtually every nuclear power plant to store spent fuel. And it was what I think one of the centerpiece recommendations of the Blue Ribbon Commission report that you remember came out in 2014. And it was one of the major 8 recommendations that came out that we get into interim storage, because I think the realization is that even if Yucca Mountain were to open in the next 5 or 6 years, it's going to probably be another decade or decade and a half before they'd be able to take fuel. So right now, there are actually, I don't want to argue with the numbers, but 9 decommissioned facilities, and soon to be 13. And as you saw, there are many more in safe store, and there are many more in the next 10 to 15 years, probably in the neighborhood of 20 that may be decommissioned. And a lot of this is because of the cost of electricity. As you well know, natural gas is very, very cheap. I think today I saw it was $2.88 an MCF. And in the deregulated states in the United States, there are about half of them are deregulated, the others are regulated. In the deregulated states, it's all about competition for the lowest cost of electricity that can be generated from whatever power source there is. And as a consequence, nuclear power has really fallen behind in the price category, unfortunately, because I think that diversity in power sources is really a major consideration. New Mexico is a regulated state. Of course, we don't have a nuclear power plant here either, but about half of them are regulated. And so it really depends to a large degree whether you're in a regulated or a deregulated state as to what the power costs are and whether nuclear power is still being generated and being used and is a viable part of the electricity mix. So price is not the only consideration. It's having a base load source that makes a huge difference. And if you have manufacturing like we do in the United States, you really need a base load source where electrons are delivered exactly as expected. You have a chip manufacturing company and you don't get the electrons delivered when they should be, you can destroy millions of dollars worth of chips just in one fell swoop. So that's and probably a lot of what you do at Los Alamos requires delivery of electrons on a very specific basis. So it's an important issue to talk about. It's really the quickest way for DOE to take possession of the spent fuel. Right now, you may not know it, or you may. All of the power companies have now sued DOE, and the utilities have sued them, and they won all their court cases because they had what's called a standard contract. And that contract required that DOE would take their fuel in 1998. That's when they anticipated Yucca Mountain to be open. Well, as we all know, it's not open, and it may never open. And so as a consequence, they've sued, and instead of it coming out of what's called the Nuclear Waste Fund, the payments to the utilities, it's actually coming out of the U.S. Treasury. It's coming out of the Judgment Fund. Every one of you are paying taxes that go into that fund to pay the utilities for not having taken their waste. So the DOE is making them whole on the casks that they've built, on the storage pads, on the security, and all of those kinds of things that it costs them to run those. So interim storage, central interim storage, is a place you could bring all of that. DOE could take possession and take it to the consolidated site, and then that would eliminate the need for the Treasury to be paying out on all these lawsuits. So in 2012, the Blue Ribbon Commission estimated that by 2020 there would be $22 billion put out in these lawsuits. Right now, I think it's up to about $7 billion, and they will continue to pay as they get sued and the court agrees to pay whatever their past expenditures are. And then after 2020, it's expected that it would be $500 million a year until there's a repository. So other points, Oak Ridge did a study in 2016 about this time of the year, put it out, and they projected that in 2040, if there was no central interim storage, the cost to the Treasury would be $53 billion, and Central Interim Storage would save $15 billion. 2050 savings of $30 billion goes out to 2060, it's $54 billion. So that's kind of real money. So, and that was, I think, a pretty accurate study that they put together. So it also, when we talk about spent fuel, there's also a lot of considerations, what's going on here at Los Alamos and other places in the country, the research that's going on. Will reprocessing occur? Will there be a way with Generation 5 reactors to actually use spent fuel and not have to do much with it, to be able to isolate it and then use it as fuel in some of these reactors? So those are all possibilities, and maybe putting it away in a repository is not necessarily the best idea for the moment. But at any rate, that's a consideration. There will almost always be packaging. If it's Yucca Mountain, all of that waste that will go to Yucca Mountain, it's basically too tall, and it's going to have to be cut down, and it will have to be packaged in alloy 22. So virtually everything that goes to Yucca Mountain is going to have to be repackaged before it goes. We think that if you're looking at a system, maybe interim storage is the place that you would do that repackaging. So it would make delivery to the site most efficient. At WIP, as an example, we learned very quickly that rail transportation is not very predictable. So we knew that truck transportation was. So we knew when the waste was coming, it could all be programmed to come so that you use your workforce at WIP to the highest degree you can, most efficiently. And probably that's what would happen at Yucca Mountain or some other repository. So and I think the other thing for the United States is to dispel the argument that there's no answer, because I think this keeps coming up over and over again, that there's no answer to dealing with the spent fuel. This is an answer. And in reality, spent fuel is very benign. There are no pumps, there's no moving parts, and a facility gets a 40-year license. The canisters have a 20-year license, but the facility itself has a 40-year license. So Kathy showed you this, so I won't go over that. This is what a spent fuel pool looks like. For those of you that may not have seen it, it's blue because of the boron that's in there as a neutron absorber, and so therefore it changes the color. These things are about 45 feet deep, so it enables you to put the fuel in, which is 17, 18 feet tall, and then lift it up and move it across the pool without ever getting out of the water, having 4 or 5 feet of water over the top of the fuel. So that's why it's that deep, and then it gets put into a cask or a canister. And this is kind of what a canister looks like. It's honeycombed, and in the slots in the honeycomb today, the companies are using a boron carbide material as a neutron absorber, so that criticality issues are of no concern. And so they continue to improve this and improve issues surrounding criticality. But this is basically what it looks like. These are other pictures of the canisters, the safety functions, their confinement. It's an inert environment. When they put the fuel into the canister, they actually weld the top closed, and then they vacuum out the water that's in the canister and replace it with helium. So it's in an inert environment, so that there's basically no oxidation going on with the fuel cladding itself or inside of the canister. So again, technical challenges, long-term corrosion issues, the bastic properties, absorber efficiencies. These are all things that in a storage facility have to be monitored. Now, I think you would recognize that inside the canister, if it's welded shut, it's going to be difficult to look at the fuel itself. So the reality is, and NRC has come to this opinion as well, is what you really need to look at is the integrity of the canister. So within the casks and within the system that we're putting in, they have cameras that inspect the canisters, they inspect the wells, and at some point they will develop an X-ray capability so they can pull the canister up and X-ray it up and down, as well as X-raying all the wells and the bottom and the top. So those are all things that are in the program to look at the long-term integrity of the canisters in particular. This shows you on the left is they've pulled this is a transfer cask, and they pull the canister up into the transfer cask, and then that shows you they go over to a permanent cask and then drop it down into it. That's how that's done. And Kathy showed you what an ISPACY pad looks like, and this is just an example. I threw this up here just so you might want to see the numbers in the cooling that goes on, and that's why we talk about 5 years in a cooling pool. You can see that after 5, you can see at the 5-year level how it really drops, and it gets into this area, and then it becomes acceptable really to put it into a dry storage system. And then you can see it deteriorates on. And if you think about the first day is the hottest day, thermally and radioactively. And the fission materials that are in the makeup of the used fuel basically have about a 30-year half-life. We're talking about strontium mainly and cesium that are in there with 30-year half-lives, which are the main characters in terms of radiation and in terms of heat. There are others that contribute, but those are the main players. And so if you think about 100 years in dry storage, the percentage left is about 12%. So it decays, if you will, rather quickly, and we generally think of 10 half-lives. You've gotten to a point where there's really nothing left. So after 300 years, it's essentially gone. Much of this has been around through at least one half-life, and some places almost 2. So it's already decayed to a considerable amount. So this is just a little slide on transportation or storage. I want to point out that most of the used fuel will have to be transported by rail. It's 80,000 pounds is the limit on the highway, and these things are between 125,000 and 350,000 pounds. So they are much in excess of what can really be put on the highway unless you do a very short, heavy haul, which you could do with multi-axles, but you're not thinking about going more than a mile or 2 in general to get to a railhead. So they've got the storage systems, and then they have what are called dual purpose casks that are for storage as well as transport. And then all of these are canister-based systems. And so that's the thing that NRC is really concerned about, is the integrity of the casks. And they have a lot of requirements for any storage site to have a major aging program to look at the cans. So in a system, just to graphically point this out real quickly, you've got the reactor fuel, you're in wet storage for 4 to 5 years, then you're in dry storage, or it could be set with, depending on what company, but Holtec's company, they can send it after 4 or 5 years, could put it on the road with their cask system. And then you're in a consolidated interim storage facility where you're doing fuel R&D and you're doing canister repackaging and getting ready for direct disposal out of that site. And then the last step is going into a permanent repository. So that's just a quick graphic design. This is a little bit about Holtec, who is our partner. They have their privately owned company. The gentleman that owns the company, Chris Singh, he is a nuclear engineer, has a PhD, and has, I think now, 92 patents. So he's a very prolific guy and very interesting. You would all like him. He's a smart guy. And, but they have about $5 billion in orders now. They have no history of long-term debt. We looked at all of the companies that were proposing to us, and they were outstanding in terms of who we looked at. They're very, very stable, very well financed, and they have a great B&D rating. And 85% of their business is in the nuclear arena. They do a few things in the other areas. So they are actually do a lot of work in foreign countries as well, and they're in 15 time zones, and so across the United States and in other foreign countries, they have a major program now to do a consolidated interim storage facility for the Ukraine. They were the licensee with the Skull Valley, or the Independent Fuel Storage Facility in Utah, and that facility was stopped because the state didn't want it, and they actually built a perimeter zone around it, which was would not allow any transportation to go through the area. So that's how the state managed to stop it, as they built a primitive area around it, and so no transportation could go through that area. So that stopped it. They spent, Holtec, I think they told me they spent $80 million on the licensing process for that. So not inexpensive. This is our site, which you can see right here. If you see WCS is right here, Andrews is 37 miles away. Eunice is 3 miles from their site, and Hobbs is about 17 miles, and Jow down here is about 15 miles away. So it's really New Mexico that's impacted by the WCS facility. It's not Andrews. It's the cities in New Mexico. Our site is right here, and we're about 15 miles north of WIP. If you go, and it's just across 62, Highway 62. It's about a mile off the road. And so Carlsbad's here and Hobbs is there, and it's 35 miles from any population. So we think it's a great location. We have 1,000 acres that we bought when we applied for the GNEP project. If anybody remembers that, that was the Global Nuclear Energy Partnership, which was going to grab spent fuel from all the reactors around the world, reprocess, and send it back to the various countries. And that sort of collapsed, even though we're still trying to collect all the reactor fuel around the world. So it's a great location. We have we have a good workforce in place with WIP and with Urenco, and we've got very, very strong support in the communities and in the county. These are, from a support perspective, these are resolutions from both the city and the county. We also, the cities and the counties have both passed resolutions. We have a letter from the governor that went to Secretary Moniz supporting the project. And in 2016, last year, in that legislative session, we passed 2 memorials, one in the House, one in the Senate, supporting the project. And by the way, those both passed by 71%. Kind of unusual. Probably wouldn't get that kind of support for your local garbage dump. But at any rate, it was, we were pretty pleased with that. So this is what the site looks like and the layout of the site. This is the 300 meters that NRC requires we have inside the perimeter of the property. So they require 300 meters. So we basically have this area in here for the site. And this is what it will look like. It will have the capacity to store 120,000 metric tons of spent fuel. Right now, there's about 78,000 metric tons that the utilities have. That's in spent fuel storage and in their pools. And it has, we'll start off with that circled red area. So this will hold 500, and then we'll build it out incrementally as the demand occurs. So we are about 4 miles from a railroad spur that's over here. We have a lot of rail in our area because of potash. In fact, at one time, we were the largest shipper of Santa Fe Railroad in terms of tonnage because of the potash that we were shipping out of the basin. So we have a lot of rail. We're about 4 miles away, and it's kind of a straight shot to the facility. And then this is where the cask transfer building will be. And we'll have a big batch system there to pour concrete. I'll show you that system in a minute. This is a built facility, and it's at Callaway in Missouri. And this is what it looks like looking down on it. So it's a subsurface system. It's below grade, and whoops, I keep pushing the wrong button here, I'm sorry. And this is what the cask looks like, or the vault that holds the canister. This is what it looks like. It's subsurface, and it has a vault that is in there, and then there's another sleeve that goes in, so you get the convection heat cooling process that goes on, and then that's what next to it is what it looks like with the canister in the vault. So the things are about 75 inches in diameter and 213 inches in height. And it will store, one of the unique features that we have is that we will be able to store anybody's canister. Canisters are like ballpoint pen refills. They only fit in the cask that that particular manufacturer has. But we are in a process of application with the NRC to get approved for every cask that's in the United States. So it will be a very versatile facility from that perspective. So being subsurface like it is, they dig down 30 feet, and I'll show you that process in a second. But the shielding, you have to recognize that if it's subsurface and there happens to be a leak or whatever, it's going to go into the earth. So it's a tremendous benefit from that perspective. And this idea of being almost, it decreases the dangers from any seismic event because it's moving with the earth. It's not above it, moving in an extra amount above the earth. And it's just really very impervious to the kinds of things that we think about in terms of hurricanes, tornadoes, that kind of thing. And then from fire and explosions and from projectiles from terrorists or whoever, it's pretty resilient to any of that as well. So it's configured to be visually inconspicuous. There's a 2-foot cap on the top of it, and it weighs, I think, about 4 tons, and so it's not going to be removed very easily. and it's, people just can't hide on the site. So this is just quickly to show you how it's done. They dig down, the excavation goes down about 30 feet and to a bottom, and this is what the vaults look like that get bolted to the bottom. And on the bottom, where you can see this concrete slab, it's a 3-foot reinforced concrete slab that's on the bottom, and then these are bolted to it. You can see the height of those compared to men that are working there. So they're very big. Then they fill all of that with high flow concrete. So it's all filled with concrete up to 3 feet from the top. And then they form another 3 foot of high density concrete reinforced on the top. And that creates a barrier to missiles and bombs and airplanes and whatever else that might crash into it. So it's a very robust system. So it's very universal in its nature, the way it's built and the way it is put together. And we think it's the best in the world, without question. And that's why we chose them. So here are the facilities that are of immediate interest. And there are, 9 or whatever it is there, 9 or 12. And those are the ones that we're focusing on and have immediate interest in obtaining their material, their spent fuel. So we're in, the licensing process is taking two avenues. The first avenue is licensing the other canisters. And we've had, obviously, a lot of opposition from other canister manufacturers. And our answer to them is really very simple, not ours, but Holtec's answer to them in the licensing process is to say, look, NRC has licensed your canister. If they've licensed your canister and the system that it goes into is as robust as that company's system, then why would the NRC not allow it to go into this system? Because it's much more robust than anything that's on the surface. So that's kind of the simple argument. There's a lot more of a technical explanation that has to be made, but that's just the basic. So we're starting with the new homes container, which is the horizontal container, and we're starting with that because there are a couple of companies that are using that in California and other places that are probably the most eminent ones that would come to the site. So we're working on getting that, and they had a license application put in for that back in August of 2016. Then the other application we have is for the facility itself. And so that started in March of this year, and we are now in a process where we're answering the questions from the NRC. Those should be complete by the middle of December, and then we'll see if they have more questions or whether they approve it. So here's the benefits that we look at, aside from the national benefits that there are from having a facility like this. 10 years of construction. The estimate is there'll be 350 construction jobs during that period. This will probably be about a $2.4 billion project, so large capital project for the area. The project itself will have about 150 employees. We intend for there to be state incentives, which we think, like WIP, we put it into roads. We think it's accountable when we put it in the road fund. We know where it went. You put it in the general fund, and there's no accountability in knowing what it did for the state. So we know when we build roads. And so we think that that's a good place to put it. And there will be an area incentive as well. And then we think that the future packaging program will probably have another 350 jobs, and there'll be some capital expenditures with hot cells and maybe fuel pools, those kind of things. And then there'll be, we think the aging process should attract a number of researchers to the project, and we think that may be 25 to 50 researchers. So that's what we think the economic, to tell you a little bit about what's going on politically, if you're interested in that, everything seems to be political, unfortunately. But in 2015, after the Blue Ribbon Commission, the Senate tried to put a bill together, and it really didn't make it anywhere. In 2015, Conaway, a representative from Texas, put in a CIS bill. In 2016, Mulvaney put one in, who you know now is the OMB, he's the OMB director. He put a bill in. And in 2016, the Senate was trying to improve this 854, which was a really big bill and covered everything in the BRC report. And it's very comprehensive, and it's been difficult to get that kind of a comprehensive bill moving. Alexander in 2016 put a provision in the Energy and Water Appropriations Bill for central interim storage. And he's done that again in 2017. This year in the House, Walden and Shimkus have put in amendments to the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, and it's okay except for interim storage. It does not allow interim storage to begin until the construction contract or construction license is approved by the NRC. So who knows how long that will take. And then it also has a restriction of 10,000 10,000 metric tons. So that's also a restriction that we don't like very much. But that's what they have. We don't think it'll really probably go anywhere. ISA and Conaway got together and have an interim storage facility bill as well. We like that. We think it does the job. It's the right legislation. And in 27, they're proposing an omnibus bill that will probably come out in December. And maybe the appropriations language, Section 307, will get into that final legislation. So if you're interested in this, call our congressional delegation. And so just quickly on the business thing, right now, you know, I think everybody knows you can't have a business unless you have a revenue source. And every decommissioned site basically costs somewhere, the Treasury, somewhere between $8 and $10 million a year. So you start adding that up and it gets to be enough money to make something happen. So consolidation makes a huge difference, probably cuts all of that cost in half. So it makes sense to do something in terms of consolidation. And it allows DOE to meet its contract again to take possession, spent fuel, and stop the drain on the Treasury. And but DOE has to have legislation to do anything. And so it's all going very slowly, and I don't know whether anything will happen or not. But if there's not a bill in Congress, we think we can do it privately. In fact, maybe even prefer to do it privately. The utilities themselves are motivated to do it, and many of them have storage funding in place that would allow some of this to happen. And Holtec is even willing to take title to the fuel, which is highly unusual. Nobody's been willing to do that, and that's one of the issues with the utilities. They want DOE to take title or somebody to take title so that they are relieved of the liability. And so this, Holtec is going to be willing to do that. We've talked about that at length. So that's a real benefit in terms of the Holtec system. So, and they're willing to take over their standard contracts and get involved in all of that. So at any rate, it's totally passive. It's really a good system. We're excited about it, and we think it's moving forward, and we're getting through the licensing process. We think that basically we will be ready to go at the end of 2021 or early 2022. Just to comment briefly, I don't like to comment on my competitor or our competitor, but I'm not sure where WCS is now. They had, as I understand it, this is just rumor, that they had 3 companies that were interested in buying it, and now they have all backed out for whatever reason. So I don't know whether that's going to be a viable project or not. But anyway, we're going forward, and probably there's enough business for all of us. And competition never hurt anybody. So I'd be happy to try to answer any questions. Thank you for your attention. Yes, sir.
One question on timings. I'm confused that something was licensed for 20 years, something 40, but the whole concept is 120?
The storage facility gets licensed for 40 years. The canisters get licensed for 20 years. You have to go back and relicense the canisters every 20 years. And the facility, you have to go back and relicense every 40 years. DOE, or NRC, has said that interim storage is safe and resilient for between 120 and 160 years.
So once the container's put in there, it's under the 120?
The canisters,
Canister?
yeah.
You don't have to touch it again once you put it in?
Once you put it in, you have to, they require an aging program where you have to go in and look at the wells and look at the canister.
So you will open it up every 20 years?
You don't open them up, but there will be some opened up. They'll do a test inspection
Okay.
of a few different canisters that they will probably want to open up. And that's going to take a hot cell, or it's going to take some kind of they're going to have to transport the canister to some place that has a pool or a hot cell to go in and look at the fuel. But that's kind of the point of looking at the canister and forgetting the fuel. The cladding on the fuel is probably going to deteriorate over a period of time, get holes in it when it's transported, it may crack, but that does not create a risk. Both EPRI and NRC do not believe that creates any kind of a risk for criticality or any of those kind of issues. If that helps.
Sure.
Yes.
What happens to the water that's in the pools and in the canisters?
The water in the pool stays in there, and in the pool, and it's circulated. It goes through a cooling system to help, and so the water is actually cooled, so it cools the fuel.
And then I think you said there was some water in some of these canisters.
The water is in the canister when they put the fuel in underwater, and then they bring it just up to the surface and weld the cap on, and then there's a system for pumping the water out and replacing it with helium, and that water stays in the pool.
So that whatever gets pumped out goes back in.
And it stays in the pool.
And it just keeps getting reused over
Yes.
and over again?
Yes. And their calculations for how much absorption needs to occur for of the neutrons, and so that determines how much boron they put in the pool.
What determines or what limits that 120-year figure? What considerations?
It's the technical modeling they have now, and that will get better and better.
And can you say any details about what that technical modeling entails, what limits?
Well, they do an analysis of the deterioration of the metal, the stainless steel can, and they do a modeling of that, and also the welds.
And that deterioration is almost all radiological?
Radiologic and heat.
And chemical?
And heat. Rad and temperature
Okay.
are the two main factors in that.
One more, after you in
If
your...
that makes sense, you may know a lot more. I'm a layperson.
In your cooling curve, after you get past 10 years or so, what half-life does that represent, do you know?
It's basically the 30-year half-life of the fission materials that are in there.
That's sort of an average over.
Yeah, it's an average over the life of the fuel and the decay. Yes, sir.
You described the security of the below ground facility pretty nicely, but what you'd be doing in New Mexico would be above ground, is that right?
The only thing that we'd be doing above ground is bringing it in, on a rail car, and then transferring it to a transfer cask that would take it to the vault where it would be dropped down. It's about a 4-hour procedure to put the transfer cask on top of the cylinder and dropping it down into it. And it takes about 4 hours to retrieve it as well.
So it would be a below-ground storage facility, just as you described
It'd be below ground.
here.
The only thing above the ground, the surface, would be the cap, which is about a 2-foot steel and concrete cap, which weighs about 4 tons.
So what was the picture you showed that had it up above ground? You showed the picture of the storage facility.
Those were other systems. One's an Ariba system, and the other is a NAC system, an NAC system. And then the horizontal one you saw in the back, that's a new home system, that's the Ariba system. So they go in fact, we have a little bit of concern about retrieval, because in that system, they push the can in on a rail, and these things are really heavy. So you have to think about how much scarring is going to occur and gouging is going to occur to the metal when you push it in. And if they've used grease when they put it in at the beginning, but when they pull it out, all that grease is going to be gone. So, how much, what kind of problems do you have when you pull it out? So those are all questions that everybody has. So we're going to figure out how to deal with that. But they've already figured out, since it goes in horizontally, how to reverse it and do it in a vertical, store it in a vertical way. So Holtec's already done all that design. Yes, sir.
Repackaging. Is that simply taking it apart and putting it back in something that's the same thing, only newer? Or is there some other kind of repackaging, like what's the state of vitrification?
Yeah, I think the repackaging that we envision is pulling the canister up into a transfer cask and then putting it down into an alloy 22. And if it has to be cut down to get into, I don't know whether you've seen a model of Yucca Mountain, they've got to have titanium shielding. So all the casks are in there, and then they have this curved titanium shield that goes over the cask, and that's a drip shield to the tune of $18 billion. And the alloy 22 is going to be about a $10 to $12 billion expenditure as well. So it's, the projected cost of Yucca Mountain now are about $110 billion.
Well, you don't expect repackaging to happen for 120 to 160 years?
Oh, I think DOE is saying in 2048, there should be an open repository. But
Their track record.
who knows?
You mentioned a 5th-generation power plant that's going to use, did you say it was going to use reconstituted fuel?
Well, I'm just suggesting that may be a possibility.
So it isn't in the development?
Yeah, I don't know whether anybody has that design. Los Alamos does a lot of reactor design. And so maybe somebody in the back room somewhere got that all figured out. I don't know. But probably. And, it'll be probably a sodium-cooled, metal-cooled reactor system rather than the cooling systems that are used now.
Is that the same thing as a breeder reactor? Don't breeder reactors already exist?
They do. And it would be essentially that. I mean, you'd be burning used fuel in the reactor, and that used fuel then would be degraded through the high temperature of the reaction that goes on. So you would come out with less toxic materials and shorter half-lives. The present fuel has plutonium and neptunium in it, which has 25,000-year half-life.
Has Holtec done any polling or surveying to find out what the New Mexican public at large thinks about its plan?
That is our next step. is we've not done it yet, but we're moving through the licensing process, and it's kind of about timing. And I was telling Kirsten earlier that we have a project design where we go out around the state. And we probably do some polling. I'm not sure how that would turn out. It may turn out very well, it may turn out negative. I don't know. You guys in Los Alamos know more about that than we probably do. But we have, very good acceptance of WIP, as an example, and Urenco has very good acceptance. And Los Alamos does, Sandia does. So I'm not sure how that poll will turn out. We would hope it would be positive if we do a poll. But, we want to go out around the state and at least hit towns with, just an arbitrary number, say 10,000 people, and then bring in the politicians for a meeting from the surrounding area and have a discussion with them, go through a description of the project and some of the safety. And we'd like to get somebody there from NRC that has a, independent opinion. We're making the presentation. It's, they may say, we don't believe you. But we may be asking some scientists from Los Alamos to join us and give us an independent opinion about what they think, or from Sandia, or from the universities. So those are kind of independent, opinions about the project. And I think that weighs a lot more heavily with the public than us telling the story. And that's why if we could get somebody from NRC to talk about what a tough regulator they are and how they regulate, and we think that has more power than us telling somebody about how tough NRC is. So those are some of the things that we want to do. And of course, we get to Albuquerque, we need to have probably 4 different meetings. When we get to Santa Fe, we have to have 10.
Well, my guess is the fear factor, which generally surrounds the nuclear industry, will figure largely in what the average person thinks about a project like this.
And we had supper earlier, and he said, how did you get WIP started? And we said, well, there was a lot of skepticism about it. We went back in the mid-'70s, and then it was through an educational process that people began to learn about it, and getting the public in Carlsbad to maintain an open mind about it. Try to understand the physics, try to understand what isotopes are and the various terminology, and gain some confidence in what's going on in the transportation system. They took a cadre of people up to Sandia to drop it on the spike and on the weakest spot and run into it with a train, and then sink it in water, see if it was destroyed or not. So those things go a long way to helping the public overcome it. And Sandia was the technical expert there, so they were giving programs to the Chamber of Commerce, and we had a big town hall meeting once a month, and they were giving their findings about salt and about everything that they were discovering about how quickly it closed and fragility of the salt, tensile strength, all of those things related to salt. And of course, the National Academies of Sciences recommended salt in 1957. And we've got 16 square miles down there. We would like to broaden the different types of waste that we could take. We could take, for instance, all the waste at Hanford, the tank waste, probably, I would bet 90% is transuranic waste by definition of transuranic. It's high-level waste because it was first cycle extraction, where it came from. So that's a ridiculous way to categorize waste. And so it needs to be done by what it is and not where it came from. And we're the only country in the world that does it. So, and then DOE is moving on that mission to produce some redefinition. And they can do that if they will. The other thing, as an example, we're counting one heck of a lot of air. We've got, by the way they count, which the 10-drum overpacks, which are really a lot of air inside, over the 55-gallon drums, we're counting the whole 10-drum capacity. And if we, right now, counting it the way we are, we've got 92,000 cubic meters. Our limit's 175,000 cubic meters. So if we didn't count the air, we would only have 60,000 cubic meters, and in the future, it would reduce the amount by 30,000 cubic meters as well. So we've got a lot of space for tank waste, we've got a lot of space for the 34 tons of weapons plutonium, we've got, which is what we take now. I mean, that will be diluted and shipped, do it for 17 billion versus 55 billion. Why wouldn't you do that? So those are the kind of things we're trying to move on a little bit. And I don't know whether you all have any high-level waste. You probably have some spent fuel here somewhere that you're hiding. But, it would be an opportunity to move that off it as well.
Have our congressmen and senators taken a position on this?
They have not really taken a position that I know, and we don't know where they'll go. And I don't know whether you all support this or don't. We think it's good for the state. The economy is not good in New Mexico. The revenue's not good. But this is another addition, and we think that New Mexico is a nuclear state. We think that you've got 2 national labs. We have WIP, we have URENCO, we have one of the 13 nuclear engineering programs in the United States. We've got White Sands. Every warhead goes through Kirtland Air Force Base. I mean, we've just got we've got the Air Force Research Facility in Albuquerque. We're just a very nuclear state, and we think it's an area that we should be thinking about expanding. I mean, look, I was telling them earlier, there are 50 million diagnostic nuclear medicine activities that go on, 50 million. And of that, 80% are Molly 99, Technetium. And so why aren't we making it in the United States? Why are we importing it? Why aren't we doing it in New Mexico? And I can tell you, in my part of the world, we're doing a lot of oil and gas extraction, and we use a lot of isotopes to block wells, and we use it as tracers, and there are just a lot of things that we can begin to think about. And you all are the experts in Los Alamos, and you could probably tell us a lot of places to go. And I think it's an avenue that I think New Mexico has a very good cluster and could expand on very easily. So I think it's a big deal. I think we need to start thinking about it.
So, sort of a follow-on to his question, is the current atmosphere doing away with regulations, has that affected NRC regulations at all? Or have you gotten that detail?
I think they're trying to shorten the period. They're not going to shorten the period unless they give them enough money to get the engineers in place to do the studies.
And how do other countries handle the SNF problem? Particularly France.
I really can't tell you what they're doing. I know France has a repository. It's in a clay formation, and I guess the northeast side of France, and they got that passed by having after 100 years, they go back and look at it and decide whether they're going to pull it all out and put it someplace else. I don't know what they do. Send it to the Germans. I don't know.
Okay, we're going to go on now. There's some more to the program, and then there'll be time later.
Thank you very much.
All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about transportation. Not a lot, but the safety of nuclear spent fuel transportation has been evaluated over the years. Starting in the 1970s, there's a very recent one in 2014. New Reg 2125 evaluates these accidents, potential accidents for rail and highway transportation of spent fuel. And this is using updated data for populations. It uses originally they just evaluated one route. Now this evaluates 16 routes, starting from basically like a power plant on the East Coast, going to one on the in the Southwest, or to a repository, or going from north to south. So they evaluated different terrain, different states, different populations, and they look at not just accidents, but they look at normal transportation. For example, what kind of dose accumulates in shipping this, along the highway, where people live by the highway, people have businesses. If the truck has a flat tire, it has to sit there until it's repaired and all that. So they figure like a 10-hour wait to do whatever has to be done to get this truck moving again. Same way with rail. They look at normal incidents, and they also look at accidents. There are very few accidents associated with shipping spent fuel, so they use DOT highway and rail accident statistics. So this includes things like fender benders, trucks running off the road with no consequence, and then they look at these worst case conditions. All of the fuel from a gasoline tank truck. So they, in this model, they immerse the cask in all of that fuel and let it burn for an hour for a truck, or for a rail cask, it has to burn for 3 hours. They have a 30-foot drop. And these are sequential things. First, they take a cask in good condition, and then it goes to these 4 tests. An impact test, that's the 30-foot drop. A puncture test onto, they drop it 40 inches onto a 6-inch diameter peg, and it cannot puncture. Then there's fire, like I said, 1 or 3 hour fire, and then it's submersion in water. And then they take a different cask, and this is a, I think it's 4-foot immersion for 1 hour, no, that's not right, for how many hours, I forget. This is a long immersion, 15 hours maybe, and then they take another cask. These were all sequential tests with the same cask. They take another cask and drop it, and submerge it in 30 feet of water for 1 hour, I think. So it has to pass these tests. It has to contain the nuclear material, limit radiation doses to acceptable levels, and prevent a nuclear chain reaction. So in most of these accidents, there's no release at all. And the doses calculated are very small. The background radiation in the United States is 320 millirem a year or something like that. And if you add in all of the medical procedures that people have, the typical average dose to an American is something like 620 millirem per year, whereas these accidents all result in less than 1 milligram. And there's a collective doses also calculated from the entire travel of the cask from, say, the East Coast power plant to the Southwest repository or whatever. And like I said, that takes into account that say a truck has to be driven by somebody, so it stops someplace overnight. Only so many hours the guy can drive, and looks at the populations along the way. And so there's a collective dose from that normal transportation also. So I guess they've I wasn't able to find this, actually, I was looking through that document, but I didn't actually find that 1,300 shipments in 40 years. I'm surprised, actually, that there were that many shipments of spent fuel in 40 years, because, like I said, back in the 70s, we stopped reprocessing in the United States, so it's less and less reason to ship this fuel around. But of course, the Navy ships fuel, to their submarines and, to Idaho and back and forth. There are shipments, and so it's, I believe they used that number and the accidents during that period to figure out how many accidents there were for a mile of transport, both for truck and for rail. And so after 9/11, people started worrying more about terrorists, and so they added some new rules. When they do a shipment, they coordinate with law enforcement agencies, they have advance notice to the states, Indian tribes, and there's a communications center that monitors the shipment while it's en route. There's armed guards, and there's a device that allows them to immobilize the vehicle so that somebody can't just, knock the driver on the head, jump in the truck, and drive away. So those are all new. Now we're going to go to talk about Yucca Mountain a lot because Yucca Mountain is located right here on the edge of the test site. This is the boundary of the test site, and it's Yucca Mountain is something like 22 miles long. It goes kind of like in an angle, north-south, a few miles wide. It's about 1,000 to 1,500 feet above the average terrain. Top of the mountain is about 4,500 to 5,000 feet high. That's mean sea level. And and I know some of you have been to the test site, you know that this is a very dry area. It's desert. There's Death Valley right next to it, the Amargosa Valley in here. Las Vegas is here. It's about 80 miles away. They're in the desert. Settlements are built where there are natural water sources, springs. And so there are a few communities out here, the Amargosa Valley, I can't actually read this, but Pahrump is that it? A few Indian Springs, I think there's a military base there, so there's probably people living around there. And so they did look at the, these populations for releases from Yucca Mountain. I guess I already covered this. This is the geography of the place. It's, like I said, it's about 5 miles from the closest point on the test site. And of course, there are a lot of deep holes that were evacuated of soil and on the test site. And so all that was taken into consideration in the safety analysis. The regulatory history for Yucca Mountain is long and tortured. There was the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982, and that created a timetable and a procedure for establishing a permanent underground repository. Responsibility was assigned to DOE, and they were supposed to site, construct, operate, and close the repository. And it was funded through a fee paid by electric utilities. It's 1 mil per kilowatt hour. In 1987, Congress narrowed the candidate repository sites to Yucca Mountain. And the Nuclear Waste Policy Act had a deadline in it. DOE was supposed to take title to all of this fuel by 1998. Of course, they missed that. But in 2008, they did submit a license application for Yucca Mountain, and NRC started evaluating that thing, and The safety analysis report is actually in several sections. The first part talks about pre-closure. This is when you receive the fuel, you package it, you put it underground, and all this time while you're filling it up, you don't close it. It's open in case you have to change something. And then there's the second part of the safety analysis that has to do with post-closure. It talks about, you know, that million years of time that goes by, that you have to account for all of the leakage, you know, into the groundwater, all kinds of accidents that can happen, think corrosion, that part was not initially reviewed, but what DOE, when they submitted that application in 2008, NRC reviewed the first part. And the first part, they actually wrote a safety evaluation report and said, okay, you could, based on this, you could start to dig this repository. Then the remaining parts of it, they were supposed to, while you're digging this, you're learning about this site. You had exploratory drift where you explored the geology, but now you're going to go actually dig the site, and you're going to learn more about it. And you may have surprises, and so this was kind of built into that safety analysis. But so in 2010, NRC was all ready to provide that first portion of the license. But an environmental impact statement was issued, there was a supplement, another supplement, and so NRC was ready to go, but funding was ended in 2010, and the only money was allowed for NRC to continue some question review. Then 2013, you know, there was like $30 billion in this fund that was supposed to have been paying for Yucca Mountain. The federal court ruled that DOE had to stop collecting fees until provisions are made to collect that waste. And so at that point, there's no more money going in, but it's still getting like over $1 billion of interest every year, I believe, is accumulating in that fund. And then in 24, of course, the utilities did not take this line down, of course, the lawsuits, right? In 2014, an appeals court directed the NRC to consider the license for Yucca Mountain. And in 2015, it published a safety evaluation report. In 2016, there was the final, I think it's a final supplement to the EIS. And now in 2017, they're trying to get a $150 million budget to restart Yucca Mountain. So, as I said, it's been a long and tortuous path, and we don't know where it will go from here. Some people say that it's impossible to actually complete this facility, put fuel in it, that it will never happen. Other people say, well, you know, we got this far, you know, even after Obama stopped funding this, you know, we kept doing these things. We're still making progress. We've gotten a long way. We think we just have to persevere and get there. But nobody knows. So that's the end of the Yucca Mountain story for now. We're just waiting for the money to arrive.
Questions?
You said one of the requirements was to limit radiation to acceptable levels. You gave some numbers, but none of those numbers answered that question. Do you have a number to go with acceptable levels?
I don't have that number, but it's less than 1 millirem is what they calculated. And, you know,
1 millirem per
there's a
total?
there's an individual dose calculated, and there's the collective dose. The individual maximum dose is less than 1 millirem.
One?
Yeah. The,
Per square meter on the outside of the container.
That's 1 milligram per
Cubic per square meter.
unit time?
no, it's the maximum dose. It's the maximum individual dose. For
Maximum individual dose
transportation,
integrated over total time, total exposure?
For an individual.
Over a year.
And that's 1 milligram.
It goes from an accident.
Oh.
Wow.
So if that cask goes off the road, and you have to understand that these things are quite big. They are intended to limit radiation exposure on the outside. That doesn't mean that there is no exposure, but they're supposed to limit exposure. There's a concrete shield, there's a metal canister, there's, it's a massive thing, and accidents, I've only read of one accident, and I'm not saying there aren't more. I read of one accident with a cask where a truck was struck, pushed off the road. The cask came loose from the truck, was thrown away from the truck. Basically, there was no damage to that cask. It was just superficial damage to the outside of it. So they retrieved the cask, put it on another truck, took it, back to their facility, refurbished the cask, and used it again. So, these are pretty hefty, pretty massive, pretty strong casks.
So I'm still a little confused. Radiation levels on the outside of the cask are something I can get my hand onto.
And I don't know the answer to that.
But radiation dose integrated to the public, I don't know how to even approach calculating that, but that's the number that apparently should apply to that statement. And
Well, like I said, there's a maximum exposed
Sure.
individual, and then there's
For a number.
yeah, and I don't know what the collective dose is. Don't know the answer to that, sorry.
all right, thanks.
Yeah.
Did your research show whether there's still a lot of design work needed for the, like not only canisters, but some kinds of containers inside that come out? Is that all designed and figured out?
Work is continually going on canisters. People are constantly finding, thinking of new, better ways to design casks. I mean, it used to be that a cask was only licensed for where it sat when they first started. Now there's a dual license cask that can be stored and shipped. There are, because there's a vast array of different kinds of fuel. These Navy cores, very high enrichment, very small. There's, very tall PWR bundles that, 17 feet tall or something like that. And there's just a vast array of these things. And so casks are continually being designed, constantly being improved. As they learn things, they make another one, So, yes.
Is there any gases produced by the radioactive decay of these fuel cells, fuel rod systems?
I would assume there are some noble gases being generated.
I mean, it's a sealed cask, so it seems kind of a lot of gas is generated.
I would think, and I don't know the answer to this, but my thought is that you already have gas in that canister, and I'm sure that they adjust the pressure to what they think is going to be needed. Okay, if you are generating noble gases, number one, it's probably a small percentage of the gas. By this time, these things are not decaying very fast. And you see that curve, right? It descends very fast, and then it kind of levels out. So I would think, and I don't know the answer. I mean, we're just exploring this situation. This is a study, right? So we learn some things, we talk about it, we learn, then we go out and we try to learn some more things. So, but I'm guessing that that would not be a big percentage of the pressure you're going to cast.
Is that an issue with your gas, Hotech gas? Do you worry about gas pressure?
Not that I'm aware of. It's filled with helium,
Right.
and to prevent oxidation from occurring, which is
So
really
they're not worried
considered.
about radioactive gas being produced?
But I'm not sure that there's any gas generation from decay.
I mean, at the end of the top of each fuel rod, they save room for the gases to accumulate. And, but I think the main point is that decay is decreasing a lot, there's not much building up. But they definitely are radioactive gases at the top of each pedal. The fuel is made to contain that.
Yes, sir.
This is all a pretty elaborate technical analysis, but ultimately what stopped Yucca Mountain was the political side of it. What are the ideas and suggestions for how to turn that part of the problem around? How to address the intense opposition on the part of the state, for example? What were their opposition points? And are there ways to address those?
Most of it has to do with water. You know, that a million years is okay. A million years is such a long time. You can't guarantee you'll be able to control this site for a million years. So what's going to happen down the road? And so the thing that's going for you is eventually, you know, the decay, you know, it does decay down to a lower level of activity, and the water sources are very limited out there. That was really the subject of two of the supplements to the EIS, because I had a slide showing this, but I couldn't seem to get it onto PowerPoint. But you know, if you ever drove across Nevada from east to west, you would go, you know, there's a level place, then there's a mountain, a level place, a mountain, a level. This is what they call basin range, and this is kind of volcanic terrain that's slowly eroding over the eons, and the material comes down besides the mountains and collects on the flats down below. And there's so little water that in a lot of cases, this water, nothing really moves out of these valleys. And so the subject of one of those supplements was the fact that, well, you know, there is, if you go down deep enough, there is an alluvial layer down there where if the material can get in there, it can actually move faster. You know, it's not really trapped in the valley, it can move. And so they estimated they tried to model how the water would move through these strata down to Amargosa Farms, which is a very small farming community. I think they said there were fewer than 14,000 people within, I forget how many miles of this site. So there are not a lot of people out there, but you don't know over a million years what will happen. You know, maybe somebody strikes gold and you get 50 million people living, you know, out there. But no, so they evaluated the normal dry, arid climate. They evaluated another scenario where we changed to a wet climate, and where you would get maybe seeps coming out. And so maybe you would get more water coming out, you know, in places like Amargosa Farms, but still, the doses are very small because the flow rates are very low. And there's a lot of absorption in the strata around there. I mean, these things were really demonstrated, I think, at the lab. Some people did some mineralogy, some chemistry on that kind of thing, and did some modeling. And I tried hard to get one of those people to come here, and I couldn't find anybody. And so it's just a slow process. It's hard to get that material out of there. And they didn't just look at radioactive materials. They looked at, the steel is composed of, nickel and molybdenum and things like that are kind of heavy metals and things that you wouldn't like to drink in your drinking water. There are limits, and they looked at those things too. And they just don't move very well. They're very slow. Yes?
I'd just like to say, when we were looking at the movement of the radionuclides, there was an experiment done in the 70s where they put water through some of the cavities which had been formed by the nuclear blasts at the test site, and they drew wells all around to see how much it had moved. And it moved very, very little. And now they have, just as for bird lovers, they have this wonderful pond, big lake there from all the water that's collected. And it's become on the migratory bird route, so that it's now protected, so it's...
First time.
No, and the movement they found is very little. It's less than a millimetre in 10 years.
Any other questions?
I think that you have to further your explanation. It got off on the wrong foot. I think that, the expectation is that there would be 3 sites that would be investigated. Ultimately, I think they started with 9 or 12, and they're going to narrow it down to 3. And then all of a sudden, in 1987, they designated Yucca Mountain. And I think all the people in Nevada call that the Screw Nevada bill. Is how they refer it. Kirsten and I, we listen to that frequently at the Energy Community Alliance meetings, but that sort of got it off on the wrong foot. And then there were all these questions about why would you choose Tuft, one of the most porous formations that there are? Why would you choose a volcanic active area? I mean, they started down this process, and so it ended up with all of these bad characteristics that were promoted by the public and the people that didn't turn against it. And so it got worse and worse. In fact, I just heard when I was at a meeting actually in Nevada, and the last number, one of the people that were opposing it said we now have 50 more litigations against it. So now it's grown from 200 to 250. And so it makes it, you begin to wonder whether it can get through all of that. But anyway, that just got off on the wrong foot, I think. And I don't know how else to explain it, unfortunately.
I don't know, I worked with Sweden and Finland on their repositories. In Sweden, they basically picked sites like we did, and then they handed it off to the scientists and said, you guys do the best science you can, and science will rule. And they took the site that was 10 times more stable. Here, the scientists didn't choose. I think that's where we failed. The politicians basically went to Texas, Washington State, and Nevada. Yeah. And the people in Texas and Washington State had way more political power to that way. Yeah. So that's why we're screwed with Nevada.
Yeah, in the original Nuclear Waste Policy Act, it was a state had a veto. They picked all these sites they were going to evaluate. If they picked your state, the state could say no, and some states did say no. And this process, of course, was kind of going, off into left field somewhere, and that was when Congress decided, well, we're going to stick it to Nevada. And
Nevada said no.
I've read that, survey shows that 51% of the population really wants the site, but none of the congressional delegation wants the site. We'll wait and see, I guess.
I think I read there was one Nevada congressman who's willing to negotiate. So the others,
Yeah, I mean, it is a way to get a bunch of money for your state, if that's what you would like to do, or maybe you want more for some kind of federal facilities, you negotiate, that's possible.
What about politicians' objections?
Well, I think that they're really driven by probably Las Vegas, which is, most of the people in the state live in Las Vegas. And I think, Las Vegas,
Has a lot of political power.
Yeah.
They would have done this back in the 50s when there were 50,000 people living in Las Vegas. It would have been operating for a long time. There's like 2 million people living in the Las Vegas area now.
But what are their objections?
They're afraid, just like a lot of people are.
Okay.
Well, I think part of it is not,
Trust funds.
I think part of it is not fear at all. It's that ticket to Nevada that is rankling with them. Nobody wants to, be the guy at the bottom of the pile, and everybody piles on. And I think there's a lot of that in there, that they just, we had a process. What happened to the process? How did we end up with this?
But I think that's an innovation in terms of our tax dollars. One of the things we hear at those energy community alliance meetings, even though we've spent like $30 billion to get Yucca going, it will take another $30 billion to get it working.
Well, once DOE accepts title to the fuel, that is, if they do go with one of these consolidated facilities, DOE will take title to that fuel, move it to those facilities, and at that point, the utilities will have to start paying again, I think.
Right, but there's still not enough money to get Yucca going. I mean, I don't know what it costs to put WIP together, but we could probably, there's other salt places, we could do more down there, or we could put it in other areas where there's these ancient salt formations, probably for less than getting Yucca going. And, I mean, despite how much we put in, it will take as much to get it going. But technically, the politicians in Nye County want it, let's be clear. There may be actual citizens in Nevada who don't, but the politicians in that county do. But still, I mean,
There are
that's
about 5 counties around that support it, but there's only 55,000 people in all of those 5 counties.
Yeah, and they'll make out like it.
Clark County and other places in Nevada.
So when Obama canceled the funding for Yucca Mountain, he created this blue ribbon commission under the National Academy of Sciences, and they looked at all the issues, and they said, you ought to start over and try to find a facility that people, an area that wants it. And do it by consensus. And that's what was done in Finland. Finland is about ready to start accepting waste at their facility this year sometime. And they did that by consensus. Of course, they have fewer reactors, less fuel. It's a smaller country. Everything is smaller about that. But they did it by consensus. And their facility is actually, I believe, right next to where some of the power plants were operating. So different situation in some respects.
The hard politics in Nevada right now is Heller is a senator, a Republican senator that's up for election. And so the Senate, as you know, has a 2-vote margin. And so they are very interested in him keeping his seat. So in order for him to keep his seat, the Senate probably won't fund Yucca Mountain, because if they do, he may not get reelected. And so those are the hard politics of it, just to cut through the chase.
I often lament that, our country isn't able to solve hard problems because we cannot work together on them. And so maybe this...
If we educated our students a little better, they could understand these kind of problems. But that doesn't seem to be happening either.
Yeah.
Well, with the new charter school, there'll be possibilities to do that.
Okay.
Who in the room wants to give up their state tax deduction from your federal tax, or your property tax deduction from your federal tax? Anybody? That's why it's hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, that given up if they raise the taxes on the wealthy as much as they want to cut them.
Yeah. So you didn't end up with a $1.5 trillion loss.
Right.
But if you have some spent nuclear fuel next to some highly populated area, where people actually know about that, and that it might be more of a hazard there, if that got a little bit of attention, people might be more interested in trying to consolidate the spent nuclear fuel.
Well, you know, a lot of people say, what's the rush? This stuff is sitting there in this dry cask storage, it's not hurting anybody, it's licensed for 120 years, let's wait.
Let's wait and let somebody else deal with it down the road.
Exactly, someone like Congressman.
A lot
I
of
I
issues
can
happen.
tell you, I went out 2 weeks ago to talk to the California Coastal Commission, and they're very concerned about storage on the fault line, and what that might occur. And so, you know, they're very interested in getting it moved. I can tell you, they're fanatical about it.
Not in California.
Well, you know, they could make a special deal because NRC is willing to license these special facilities where maybe one reactor could accept it from another reactor, you know? That's possibly, I mean, I don't know. Many things are possible if you try.
Well, if there aren't other questions, I know this conversation could go on. I encourage you all to join the state study committee and put in your 2 cents, learn some more about it, and there'll be more meetings around the state. We'll send out messages. Thank you all for